Hey everyone, welcome to OneStopTabletop. My name is Will, and today I'm going to be teaching you how I create effects and abilities for the board games that I've made. With that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so by now you've probably already made all of the core rules and mechanics for your game, but you'd like to add in a little bit of extra flavor and uniqueness to some of the cards, or maybe just some abilities that players have. So I'll show you how it is that I do this, and while doing this, I'm going to create my own few factions for Settlers of Catan here. So I will follow along with you and show you how each of these steps apply in the way that I do them. So where do we begin? Well, there's essentially two different types of effects that we can use for our games. Those that affect the components of our game and those that affect the actions of our games. I like to start with the component side, so I'm going to go ahead and grab my Settlers of Catan, and you should grab a pen and paper and start writing down for your game. Let's take a look. Alright, we're going to start with the most zoomed out view of our game that we possibly can. So just for a moment, I want you to take a look at all of the components of your game, and don't think of them as individual cards or pieces or anything like that. What I want you to do is think of everything as if it were blank, if it were just white pieces of cardboard and paper, and I want you to take all of those components, put them on the table, and put them into stacks. Or every stack should have the same component in them, or any components that are the same size and shape. For example, when I'm doing my Settlers of Catan, I'm going to put all of the resource and all of the development cards together into the same pile. All of the hexagon pieces that make up the board, that's going to be in one pile, regardless of what's on it when we play the game. And all of the game pieces, all the roads and settlements, those are all going to be in one pile as well. Now in the beginning, this isn't going to seem like a very interesting or useful step, but I find it really helps to keep me organized as I zoom into each of these individually to find interesting effects that I can make for my game. Now that we've started that process, let's go ahead and write down what each of these piles or stacks are that we have created. In my example for Settlers of Catan, I have one stack for hexagon tiles, I have one stack for game pieces, I have one stack for small cards, and with my version, longest road and largest army are two larger cards, so I'm going to put that in a separate stack for a larger card stack. So 4 stacks in total. So I want you to go ahead and do the same thing for your game as well. Now that we have a basic foundation for building up effects for our game, let's start diving into each of these piles individually. So I want you to take about one step in for each pile and separate them slightly further by one broad or general term for each one. For my example here with Catan, I'm going to separate the hexagon tiles into each of their different types. So the sheep, the grain, the wood, the sea tiles, all separately. For the cards, I'm going to go ahead and start splitting them up into the individual resources that they represent, development tiles as well. I'm going to split up each of the player pieces just by color, not by what they individually do. I'm also going to make a separate pile for the dice and for the robber. I'm also going to split up my longest road and largest army card as well. And that will be it for this step. So just like the last step, go ahead and write each of these down. From here you can keep repeating this process as many times as you need. Every time zooming in a little bit closer on each individual component and writing down what it is that you are zooming in on. For example, of my Settlers of Catan, I can zoom in on the number that might appear on a hex tile. I can split up my player pieces into the roads, houses, and settlements. I can even zoom in on my individual development cards and put them in order of each different effect that they have. Many games will be able to be zoomed in far further than I can with Settlers of Catan. Each time that you do one of these zooming ins, I want you to write down what it is that you are zooming in onto each component of your game. There are several examples of games that go crazy with this. Anything on your component can be potentially used. There are examples of some games that will use the artist's name on a card to use an effect. There are other games that will use a tiny, tiny piece of art that is on there that you might think is nothing, but actually becomes something very important later on. So each time that you look at a component, look at every single piece of it and write down every single piece. You may never think that you'll ever use it, but this list will come in handy later on for you. Once you have a list of components that you are comfortable with, we're going to be taking one final look at the components, but this time we're not going to be zooming in on anything. This time we're going to be looking at where your components are placed on the board. So go ahead and set up your game as though you're going to play, and this time you're going to write down where all of your game pieces are and where they could be during the game. To look at Settlers of Catan, we'll have the board, we'll have a pile of pieces that's in front of each player, we'll have a hand of cards, we'll have individual decks, we might even have a discard pile, we'll have where each of the pieces go on the board, and we can zoom in even further. We can look at each individual hexagon tile that a piece can be on for Settlers of Catan. Now, a bunch of other games do way crazier things than Settlers of Catan. You can look at anything as far as cards that are banished out of the game. You can look at the different orientations of some cards, whether or not they are flipped face up, face down, if they are turned 90 degrees to the right or even to the left, if they are upside down. You can look at different tiles on game boards. Perhaps they're flipped over, face up, face down in a discard area. One of my favorite examples of looking at areas of a game to use as an effect is actually in the collectible card game Yu-Gi-Oh! And we're specifically looking at a card called PARASITE. And I love this effect. This is awesome. After you flip the card, so after it's attacked or used or activated basically, you pull this card face up in your opponent's deck and then shuffle the deck. And the first time I ever saw that, I thought it was just amazing, and I love this. This is such a fantastic use of the areas of a game that you can use to have interesting effects happen. I highly recommend this. There are other crazy things from other games, such as just the orientation of the card. Is it turned 90 degrees to the left, 90 degrees to the right? Is it upside down? Which way is it facing? There are also other games that will use discard piles and banished piles that are two separate things, even though they're basically the same. There are examples of this all over, so go crazy with your game and write down every single step that you can, because you never know what fantastic, wild, crazy thing that you might make that turns out to be really awesome. So now that we have a list of all of the components and where they can go in our game, we're going to move on to the next step, which is actions. And actions is pretty much going to be anything that can affect the state of the game when it's being used. Often this is things like drawing a card, playing a card, moving a card, possibly even rolling dice. So we're going to use the exact same process that we used before. However, this time there's not going to be as much zooming in. Most games don't really have actions that are super complicated, but if you do have super complicated actions, feel free to go through the exact same process that we went through before with our components, but this time with actions. So now we have a list of all of the components, where they can be placed in our game, and the actions that we can take in our game. But how do we actually turn that into effects? And one of the easiest places that I've found to start making effects is to actually look at things like factions or groups in your game that can have similar effects. I've come up with 4 very similar questions that can help you develop what kinds of effects and abilities that you want for factions. So let's go ahead and take a look at these. So you can take some time to answer these questions for each of the factions or groups in your games if you want to go that route. I'm going to look at the first question here. What do I want this faction to be good at? I see this typically as where you put things like your +1 effects. Things that make them just a hair better than everyone else, but nothing that makes them crazy overpowered compared to other places. This is a really good area to answer questions for broad effects that you want to have in a whole group. Several different groups can also have the exact same +1 effect in this way. This is just where I see the best place to put something like that. The second question, what do I want this faction to be the best in the game at? This is the one where you're really going to start branching out and making effects that are unique for each one, because they're going to be the best at the game at something. For example, of Settlers of Catan, this comes out pretty easily to things like, I want this faction to be the best in the game at gathering wood. Or I want this faction to be the best in the game at having a big hand of cards. Or the best in the game for building buildings. Now, how you see those coming out is all up to you and how you want your game to be shaped. The third question, what part of the game do I want to make even easier? This is my favorite question. This is actually how I prefer to view doing factions and effects in my games. Usually I find that when I'm playing a game and I have a faction that makes one aspect of the game even easier, I feel like, oh, this is going to be the game-winning faction every single time, and I'm usually wrong. But it tends to be the one that makes it the most fun. You feel in a way that you're sort of almost breaking or cheating the game, but in a totally fair way. So it tends to feel really, really good. You feel like you have a strategy, that you know what you should be working towards. You know already what it is that you're good at. This, I feel, is one of the best questions that you can answer when making your factions for a game. Now, the fourth and final question, what part of the game do I want to take advantage of? This is the part where I actually want you to start getting creative. This is where you can start using the pieces of your art that you wouldn't really think would be a part of the game, but that you can use as part of the game. I've seen this used in some games where simply the shadows coming off of a barrel are part of the game that you can use, or a tree. A great game, if you want to look into this, is Betrayal at House on the Hill. This game has so many different stories going on, and so many times have I found that they will have a storyline using something that I thought was totally nothing, that I thought was just window dressing on the art of the game, but ends up actually being used as a core part of the game. So this question is really where you can start getting crazy and artistic and have a lot of fun with. If you're making a fun game, this is going to be the question for you. With these 4 questions in mind, go through each of your factions or groups and ask yourself each of these 4 questions and see if any of them answer for your game. If they do, go ahead and write them down. You can come back to it later and create more thought out effects or abilities for each of these factions. So what if our game doesn't really have factions or groups that we can create effects and abilities for? Well, in that case, you're going to want to grab your list and find the parts of the game that you feel would be the most fun to affect. Each one that you find, just go ahead and write it down in a list, and you can come back to that list later on when you're creating all of your separate effects and abilities. Now, if you're still looking for additional places that you can have effects or different things that effects can affect, you can actually look at the context of the game. This is where it really helps to look at the storyline of what's going on in the game, and sometimes that might help you get effects. I've seen games where sometimes your hand represents things that you are actually thinking of. There are other games where your hand might represent the reinforcements that you have from your army that are just about to come over the hill of the mountain. This is where you really need to start diving deep into what is it that your game is about, and what is the contextual reason that you are doing some of the things that you are doing. These are a lot harder to figure out, especially because they can change so often in a game. But they can also be a good place for you to look for if you are trying to find more effects that are more contextual or that help out with the storyline of your game. There's one final type of effect or ability that you can add into your game, and that's to actually add tokens or counters to your effect or ability to make them function. This is usually like any time someone takes a certain action, you put a token on a card, and once it's reached 3 or more, whatever number you set off, then some sort of effect goes off. I try to keep these type of effects or abilities down to a minimum just from a standpoint of production. They're very easy to add into any game, they're very easy to use, but I try to use them sparingly because I don't want to fill my game up with a whole bunch of tokens that will never be used. So feel free to use them as often as you see fit, but if you are trying to keep into consideration the physical size of your game or how many components you have that are physical in your game, I would try to stay away from these effects and abilities as much as you can, but don't be afraid of them and certainly consider them when you are looking into your game. Regardless of which method you decide to use, you should always go through and check off things on your list. So every time something uses a specific component or action of your game, go ahead and either check it off the list or write down next to it what it is that's using it. This is a really handy way to see how spread out and diverse your effects and abilities can be for a game. The more spread out and diverse that they are, generally the better the game is. I hope one or more of these methods has helped you create effects and abilities for your games. I've been using them for several years and they've always come in handy when I'm really stuck at a place and can't figure out what it is that I want to do next. Before we go, I'd like to show you what I've come up with while following these same guidelines for making factions for Settlers of Catan. I followed the same path that we did in the video and started with the components. I found the hex tiles, the cards, the pieces, and the large cards all made their own separate piles. Underneath the hex tiles, I found stone, brick, sheep, wheat, wood, sea tiles, the 3 1 harbors, the 2 1 harbors, and the numbers on each of the individual hex tiles. Under the cards pile, I found the resource cards, and each one of those had the stone, brick, sheep, wheat, and wood. I also had the development cards, under which I had the knight, monopoly, road building, year of plenty, the market, the palace, the chapel, the university, and the library. I also had the large cards, which were just the longest road and largest army victory point cards. Under the finals deck, I had the pieces, which I separated out into, we had the player color, and under each of those there are the roads, settlements, cities. We also have the dice, and we have the robber. That was all the components that I could find for Settlers of Catan. So next I moved on to the places, which I had the board, I had the hex tiles, and I had the spaces in between the hex tiles as well. I had the sea tiles. Outside of there, we also had the space in front of the player, The building space, which is technically the spaces between the hex tiles. Same as the road space, though slightly different. We also had the resource decks, and I had a discard pile as well. And those were all the places that I could find. The last section that I had, actions, I had roll dice, build, draw cards, discard cards, play cards, trade cards, and move the robber. Once I had this full list of components, actions, and places, I decided to start looking through and finding things that would be fun to create for different effects. Each time that I created an effect, I did a light crossing off of that action, place, or component. That way I don't use it again for a separate effect. So let's start looking at the different factions that I created very quickly. The first faction that I made was the Thieves. Whenever you move the robber, you gain one resource from any tile that's touching where the robber is, or you can look at your opponent's hand. If they have the 7 or more cards, then you make them discard down. Second faction that I decided to do was the Builders. So whenever you build a settlement or a city, you gain one resource of one of the tiles that you're touching. Next I had the Traders. You get to pick one resource. That resource counts as 2 cards anytime that you're trading with a harbor and a harbor only. Another faction that I created was the Scientists. Whenever you draw a development card, you gain one resource of your choice. Another faction, the Stargazers. You look at the top 3 cards of the development deck and rearrange them into any order that you'd like. Another faction that I created was the Architects. You replace one resource with another when building a settlement. So basically, it's a settlement requires a wood, a brick, a sheep, and a wheat to build. You get to pick one of those anytime you build a settlement and replace it with another type of resource that you choose. The last one that I created was the Laborers, and they could hold 9 cards before being hit by the robber rather than 7 like most players. Now obviously many of these factions would be way overpowered or way underpowered in the game and would need some tweaking just to figure out how their basic rules worked. But you can see I created all of these in a span of under 5 minutes. So you can see how just by taking a look at all the components, actions, and places of your game, you can quickly start getting a whole bunch of ideas for different factions that all do drastically different things to your game. This concludes my very first video for One Stop Tabletop. It was a ton of fun to make, and I can't wait to make some more. If you enjoyed this video at all, please like and subscribe, and please share with some friends. I hope you guys have a great day and have fun making all those games.